trying to differentiate with sensitive kids, when is it just the trait of high sensitivity and when have they moved into a potential diagnosis of anxiety is what you're asking?
Yes.
First of all, I'll say that we mental health professionals, we all think of anxiety as sort of a continuum, right? Where first you just have a little bit of stress, then the stress increases and maybe it's a little bit of overwhelm. We all know about overwhelm as, for highly sensitive kids, right? And then after overwhelm, it starts to become a little more uncomfortable. And I would say that when overwhelm, remember overwhelm is preventable, right? So if we can prevent it, then we're definitely just in overwhelm. Not that that's just, because that looks like a huge temper tantrum meltdown. So for parents, that's never a just overwhelm. Overwhelm or overstimulation is huge for parents of sensitive kids. When it becomes chronic, so the children are living their more of their lives almost overwhelmed than not, or every single day the meltdown happens and you can't get them out of it. You can't help them. And the simple tweaks to prevent it don't work. Then I'd say we're starting to look at anxiety setting in. There are diagnostic criteria for generalized anxiety disorder. That would be the most common, easily diagnosed. I would definitely encourage folks to know what those criteria are. How do you recognize that, especially in pediatrics? But it's very hard to determine the difference between chronic overwhelm and anxiety. So here's what I do. I interview the family about the child's life. Now, just because there's lots of things that are overwhelming, and I think they should maybe really dial back the kid's life, for example, doesn't mean that it's not anxiety. If it's happening, too much of the time, it's too consistent, and it's sort of dominating their lives, then we're going to look at anxiety. And listen, there's nothing wrong with an anxiety diagnosis. One should be aware when anxiety is happening, whether adult or child. It's really important because anxiety is treatable. I tend to diagnose most of my sensitive kids with anxiety, with generalized anxiety disorder. By the time they go for mental health, by the time the parents are reaching out for help, then they have gotten into the point of having anxiety, right? It's definitely happening. They're struggling. One of the things that we want to be careful of in this is that a sensitive child is so reactive to their environment, so noticing, so thinking, that with all of that going on, that looks like anxiety, and we can misdiagnose then. So if it's just that they're really noticing and tuned into and aware of what's going on in their environment, I might not call that anxiety. According to the research, probably 70% of sensitive kids are introverted. One of the things that I see happens when the children are getting, or youth are getting too overwhelmed too much of the time, probably or possibly having anxiety, there can develop a pretty significant level of rigidity to control their environment. Heck, we know this, right? I often preach that I'm a control freak, and it's about anxiety. And trying to prevent it, trying to get control of one's environment. Another one is maybe certain kinds of sort of obsessive behaviors. So they might self-harm, they might refuse to engage in certain environments or activities that they did before. Unfortunately, if in many families, we love our kids and we see the best in them. And we don't want to think that this might be a problem. So we have our rose-colored glasses on. We see that we see them as just having a hard time, right? But what can happen is we might start to see some OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, which is an extreme controlling of the environment. So when I look at, just starting when they start to create specific rules in their lives, one might be selective mutism. One might be very controlled attitudes around eating and difficulty with eating. We see this a lot in sensitive children. Another one is school refusal. And so these are big ones that we, big, probably if you have any of those things going on, you've already sought help, right? But the beginnings of it, think back about, or think about what would the beginnings of that be? Just a meltdown every time it's time to sit down at a family meal, right? So you've heard me say that family meals at the end of the day are not good, not advisable for our sensitive children, because they've already gone through the whole day and they've used up all their resources. So we want to have a really open view of that. But if this, it's okay to have them come together, especially if we give them the rest beforehand, right? But then if we've done everything right, we've created the right environment, then, and they still are having that meltdown, then they're starting, I think that there's anxiety going on. Another example that I get a lot in my clients is screen addiction. And, I have parents wanting to have their kids assessed for ADHD or anxiety, considering medication for these things, but they still haven't taken the screens away. And the screen is, I don't know about you, I treat my own anxiety with screens a lot, right? And lose hours. And so the kids might be trying to use escapism, or using their screen addiction has become their self-medication. Okay, let's look at slightly younger children, maybe for around behaviors we might see. Really less of an ability to self-regulate. So unable to come down after the meltdown, after the overstimulation, that they continue to really struggle. I know of a sensitive child who could not tolerate any talking or radio or music in the car. Zero. Oh, let's talk about me as a little kid and an older kid too. Misophonia. That just absolute incredible sensitivity to mouth sounds, especially around eating or chewing gum, that kind of thing. That can really cause anxiety. That requires treatment. There are so many great treatments. A lot of them are just behavioral. I'm not talking about medication for children. Picking and hair pulling. There's a diagnosis for and lots of treatment around this kind of thing, but skin picking, or lots of kinds of touching that is repetitive, turns into self-harm. That's a sign of anxiety.